On his way back from the barn, Herschel Malloy trudged through the morning fog that levitated over the Kansas pastures like a misty ghost. He'd just finished feeding the chickens and his pot-bellied sow Taffy, and was heading inside where his wife Fay would have a cup of tea ready for them. Herschel usually loved this part of the day. He enjoyed the smell of the dew-covered greenery and the cool touch of daybreak on his skin. But today, the wet ground smelt like old mulch, and the air felt like the caresses of the Grim Reaper. Fay's appointment was today. She'd been complaining of migraines regularly, and after consulting with Dr. Mireles, the neurologist, they decided to drive to Topeka to get her scanned for brain cancer, the same disease that had taken Herschel's mother decades earlier. The results weren't concerning, but a few weeks later the doctor called and asked if the two of them could come by her office in a few days. There was something she wanted to follow up on. At least, that's all he heard before Fay plucked the phone from his hands to talk to Dr. Mireles directly. The burdensome thought of his wife being worse than they first believed weighed down on Herschel as he made his way to the house. He came in to find Fay sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup in her hands. He took his place across from her, wrapped his hands around his own mug for the warmth, but couldn't muster the strength to bring it to his lips for a sip.
Don't fret so much, dear. You get your blood pressure up.
I can't help it. It's just one more thing on the pile of all I've seen. It's really challenging me here.
He hadn't been functioning around the farm properly since the test. He was leaving the gate open, or the feed out. He'd even left the truck running after coming home from the store once. Herschel recalled the state his mother ended up in. His time in the army had exposed him to conditions that broke men down to points they sometimes never recovered from. Yet he couldn't think of one of his mates from his time in Vietnam who looked as bad as she did. She didn't just decline, she deteriorated. What terrified Herschel the most about what today possibly held was the thought of having to see it all happen again to another woman he loved more than anything else. Glancing at the clock, ready to get this over with as quick as possible, Herschel suggested they head out. Fay picked her purse off the hall bureau as Herschel placed his worn regiment ball cap on his head, and they both put on their coats. After backing the pickup to the street, they headed towards town. The morning was still young, with the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The fog had vanished by the time they reached Bison Hill, which was an interesting name, as it was one of the lowest lying areas in the state, and bison hadn't been documented in the area since before President McKinley. Traffic was light, and there were only a handful of cars parked on the street for Herschel to ease around.
You missed our turn, Herschel.
Fay said abruptly.
I don't think so.
You did. It's on Curtis Avenue, where the bank is at. Remember?
Herschel couldn't recall what street the neurologist's office was on, or what building was where they were supposed to turn at. He figured he was just distracted with the thought of bad news when they got there, like with the gate, the feed, and the truck. They made a U-turn at Veronica's, a diner Herschel and Fay stopped at most Sundays after church. As Herschel was about to turn back on the street, Fay sympathetically touched his arm.
Why don't we stop in for a bite?
Now?
There's plenty of time, and they aren't even busy yet.
Herschel nodded, thinking that some time in a familiar place would get his nerves under control. Turning back, he pulled into a spot. Fay and Herschel took a seat at their favorite table. It was in the middle of the restaurant, an equal distance from the drafty front door, and a monitor the owner set up in the back to play music that was always turned up too loud. Almost immediately after they got seated, a waitress came over with her notepad. Her name tag read Ashley.
What can I get y'all this morning?
Fay picked up her laminated menu and glanced through the index of breakfast items.
Let me get the ham and cheese omelet and a cup of black coffee.
Ashley jotted it down, then turned to Herschel. He was still too anxious to feel hungry, so all he requested was a glass of water and some plain toast. Right as Ashley passed their order to the cook, the parking lot began to fill with cars whose occupants filed in like lines of ants. Herschel and Fay had just beat the rush. As the customers picked their tables and the waitresses scurried to each one to collect drink orders, Herschel glanced around the formerly quiet diner that was now bustling like Times Square. Eyeing each of the tables, Herschel studied the people who sat at them. A trio of chatty ladies who were either sisters or lifelong friends sat near the front. A group of men in golfing outfits were seated at the counter. Surrounding him and Fay were different numbers of people of varying ages. What was the same about all of them was no one sat alone. Alone. What a black hole of a word. It made Herschel think back to when he was a grunt, keeping watch while his platoon slept in the jungle brush of Vietnam. He remembered the painfulness of fear and anxiety that came with sitting up through the night with only the sounds of rain and distant gunfire accompanying him. The scariest thoughts he had wasn't dying the way his men in his squad had, but erroneously being left behind at his post. Disregarded. Forgotten. Herschel leaned over slightly to see who sat directly behind Faye. It was a man and a woman with their backs towards him, and sitting across from them was two young boys sipping chocolate milk from their kids' glasses. They were obviously a family, and based on the way they were dressed in khaki shorts and tees, likely vacationers. Their picturesque scene reminded Herschel of when he and Faye would take their sons, Charles and Robin, on summer road trips up north.
What are you looking at?
Faye finally asked after watching Herschel lean back and forth so many times she was expecting him to fall over.
Those folks behind you've got two boys who look just like Charlie and Rob when they were that age.
Faye rotated in her chair for a quick peek, then turned back without being obvious.
They look like they're on a trip.
I thought the same thing.
Herschel stared out the window onto the street. He then said to Faye without taking his eyes off the outside world,
Do you ever feel like we were cheated out of our boys?
What do you mean, Herschel?
Faye responded, a tad shocked. Herschel sighed like a deflating tire.
I mean, do you ever feel like their accident in Denver stole them from us? There's something unjust about a mother and father outliving a son. But two, that's just unfair. That's a defiance of nature.
Faye clasped her hands together and looked down as if she were going into mourning all over again. She didn't say anything, and Herschel immediately regretted bringing it up when the two of them already had enough to worry about today. Ashley brought out their food, and after a quiet blessing, the two of them ate in silence. Upon arriving at Dr. Medeli's office, Herschel and Faye discovered that even after stopping for breakfast, they still had a little time before the appointment. Rather than whittling the minutes away in the waiting room, they decided to walk across the street to a place called Life's Grand, a new flower and gift shop Faye had been wanting to visit. The brick exterior and drywall inside were painted pink with stripes of chromatic gold. As they entered, Herschel and Faye were greeted by a burst of natural flower scents, not the synthetic fragrances of chemicals, but an authentic concoction of overlapping sweets, bitters, and sours. Passing through the vast selection of home decor and handmade crafts that sat organized on fold-out tables lining the walls, Faye's eyes caught a decorative box of wooden Christmas ornaments. They were flat, round pieces cut straight from saplings and hung on ribbons, and on their centers were burned-on silhouettes of snowflakes, reindeer, and other jolly holiday mascots.
How much for a box of those, hon?
She asked the girl who was setting them out.
The 12-piece set cost $14, and the 24 cost $28.
She answered.
They are just lovely. We threw out all our old ornaments when we took down the tree this year. They were just some cheap plastic things with glitter that was falling off of them, not something nice like these.
Herschel thought he saw at the back of the shop a rack of leather-crafted belts and wallets. He left his wife up front and headed towards the display when something else seized his attention. In the store's big window, where they could get plenty of light, were bouquets of sunflowers tied together with ribbons in every color of the rainbow. The flowers' plump middles were as brown as rich earth and surrounded by a fiery ring of yellow petals, just like the ones his mother used to grow on the patch of land he now fed his chickens on. He then noticed among the botanical forest, but not a part of it, a single sunflower sitting by itself in a glass of tinged water off to one side. This sunflower, which had likely been long excluded for not having any others to make a full bouquet, was not the beauty the others were. Its colors were faded, and its petals and leaves were breaking off in shriveled flakes from having been cast aside for no telling how long. Herschel saw the face of his mother in that sunflower, then his son's. He saw Faye, as well as the men he'd watched die for their country in a faraway territory that was no better off with their sacrifice than without. The last person he saw was himself there, a lonely old man who'd seen them all die before joining them, and he couldn't help but cry at the sight of his own reflection.
Did it get you?
Faye asked as she walked over to him with her newly purchased box of ornaments.
Huh? Oh,
Herschel was afraid of Faye seeing the tears running down his face, but realized she thought he'd gotten sprayed by the timer-set contraption overhead that misted on the flowers every so often to keep them fresh.
yeah, I leaned over too far to take a whiff and it doused me.
He lied and wiped his face on his sleeve.
I think it's time we head over.
Faye suggested. Herschel nodded and took one last look at the floral showcase before making his exit, taking his wife's precious hand as they crossed the street. The aesthetic bonsai tree in the waiting room did little to help Herschel feel any better, and neither did the Bluetooth speaker humming harp music to sounds of a brook on the table next to him. Intended to create a calming atmosphere, it was having quite the opposite on Herschel, making it feel as though someone was holding a running chainsaw only a few inches from his ear.
How's your head feeling right now?
He asked Faye.
It's all right, dear. Everything is all right.
She gave him a little smile. Herschel was convinced Faye was lying to make him feel better. She always hid the way she was feeling if she thought it made other people feel better. As a nurse, caring for others was part of Faye's nature. She generously put her own needs after everyone else's, and that inspired Herschel to try to do the same throughout his entire life. What would he do without her role model strength? Weighing on his mind like an anvil, that was his final question for which he was not certain of the answer. Herschel turned towards the speaker to find an off switch. When he picked it up, he noticed it was set upon what appeared to be a photo album with a tag on its cover that read, "Donated by the Bison Hill Historical Society." The cover opened with a crisp snap of new plastic, and on the first page was a black and white photograph of an event Herschel had forgotten he knew. It was of the ribbon cutting at the newly opened Winnett Bridge across town, named for the creek it went over that had long since dried up. On the next were pictures of a county fair. The year 1966 was written next to it with black marker. Allegedly, that had been the largest gathering of people in Bison Hill's history. Herschel thumbed through a few pages and found one with the portrait of Charles L. Robinson, the first governor of Kansas after gaining statehood. Herschel was aghast at how with every page he found some connection with the images plastered in them. He remembered his mother taking him to the opening of Winnett Bridge, and especially the walks they would take across it together. As a boy, he dropped pebbles and natural debris into the water below. He recalled taking Faye to the fair that very year, as it was only a few weeks earlier he'd proposed to her. Herschel wondered if he looked through the crowded pictures hard enough he could find the two of them somewhere, holding hands while still in their youth. As for the portrait, it was none other than former Governor Robinson, whom Herschel and Faye named their sons after. Charlie and Robin's namesake was owed to a man they hoped their children would one day be as successful and revered as. Herschel sat the album between him and Faye, who, like Herschel, was delighted at the sight of old memories in the photographs. They pointed out the farmhouse near the highway when it was still painted bright red, and the front window of a bakery that was now a pet shop. A picture of the schoolhouse was in there, a bold structure that was later demolished and replaced by a more modern side of education. The gloomy clouds that had been hanging around Herschel's head were vanishing, and his spirits had improved. These pictures of things, places, and people gave him more than just a reminder. They gave him an assurance, a belief that living a life so decorated by experiences was enough to fill any void left by illness, anxiety, or loneliness, in the way the ocean does a tide pool. They had flipped through almost half of the album when the receptionist sent them in. Herschel helped Faye to her feet and walked back with his arm interlocked with hers, as glad as if they'd just heard the roll up yonder and their names were the first ones called. After requesting they take a seat, Dr. Mireles sat across from Herschel and Faye at her desk. She put on her wide-rimmed glasses that hung around her neck before proceeding to search through the cluttered file cabinet beside her. It was later in the morning now, and the room glowed with the bright rays let in by the office's skylight. The doctor sat up when she found what she was looking for, a paper file folder with their last name on the tab, and opened it in front of them. "So, Mrs. Malloy, have the migraines been getting any better?" she asked as she flipped through the folder's contents.
I think so. I've been eating more fruits lately and watching less TV, and I think that's helped.
"Wonderful. I thought from the beginning there wasn't anything to be concerned about." Dr. Mireles clicked open the pen on her coat pocket and began to write on one of the forms from the folder, which she nonchalantly closed and slid to the side. "All right. Now on to you, Mr. Malloy. To know how far along we might be, I'm going to need a brief rundown of any more impairments in thoughts or actions you might have been experiencing." Herschel was suddenly confused. He felt like he'd just been knocked back 20 feet, and the desk the three of them sat around was now off in the distance. What did the doctor need to know about him for? Before Herschel could ask for clarification, he noticed the tab on the folder before him had an H. Malloy on it, and not an F.
Well, he missed a turn on the way here, but I thought it was just a simple mistake. But then at breakfast, he said that our sons Charlie and Robin had died in an accident. That's not completely true. Robin was killed while away at college years ago, but not our Charlie. He sells real estate in Emporia.
Herschel now felt 40 yards back. He could no longer see his wife, the doctor, or anything in the room they were currently in. He really had said that at Veronica's, hadn't he? Why would he, when they'd just seen Charlie at Christmas? He helped the two of them throw out those old ornaments Faye was wanting to replace. Dr. Morelos looked concerned.
Oh dear, if you're experiencing misconceptions and long-term knowledge like that, then you may be further along than anticipated.
Further along what? What about my wife? Isn't that why?
Herschel blurted out, trying to get caught up. Everything got quiet. Realizing what was wrong, the doctor spoke to Herschel softly, compassionately, taking off her glasses before she said anything.
Herschel, you're here because your wife thinks you may be developing early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Do you recall anything in the last few weeks where you were leaving things unfinished?
The gate, the feed, the truck.
He thought to himself. Herschel said nothing. He just sat there with the expression of someone who had just missed the last train as Dr. Morelos went on.
The early stage affects day-to-day actions, but later ones affect more than that. They affect your
Memories.
Herschel finished for her. His head slowly tilted down until his chin was on his chest. Then he crossed his arms and his entire body quaked. Faye clutched his shoulder, but was puzzled when she saw he wasn't crying. He had a big smile and was silently shaking with laughter. At what? She had no clue, and neither did he. Maybe it was at the hours he'd spent that day pointlessly anxious, or maybe it was at the unnecessary answer he found to a question that was no longer his.